Okay. Um, Hello, I guess. Welcome to this workshop. Just quick background. This is sponsored by the CSCU and UBCO Design. So it's a collaborative venture. And we're really excited to be able to go through some of these UI tips and tricks. I'm focusing kind of on UI and UX a little bit in this workshop. My name's Opie. I'm the president of the UBCO Design Club. And this specific workshop was designed by myself and our lead designer, Matthew. Thanks, Matthew. Just wanted to shout him out. He's great. And also the rest of the UD team.
What's
They
up?
popped off. I love them. And the CSU, I wanted to shout out them for giving us this opportunity to be able to do this workshop and host it through BC Hacks. We're really grateful for that. Okay, so hoping you guys have had a good day and everything is good vibes. And I'm just going to not shut up for the next hour. So good luck. Um, Feel free to hop in with any questions. But yeah, I'm just gonna go. There's gonna be a lot of content. Hopefully it's really useful. So we can just jump right in, okay? Okay, cool. I'm just hoping the screen share is working for everyone. Cool. So just right off the bat, we wanted to just kind of go through a few introductory pieces to how UI works and how UX functions in our actual lives, right? So obviously this slide is just us trying to illustrate some kind of examples of things that might not be obvious at first, things that might seem illogical. And I think, it brings us back to the quote where UX and UI design is often described as something that is best done like water. So good design is like water. You don't really notice when design is extremely good as you don't really notice when your water is, if your water is good, you're good. You only really notice the taste of water when it's bad. And it's kind of the same with design, where there are so many things in our lives that we see as just being obvious. Like, of course they work like this. But when you think about it, if they didn't work like that, it would be kind of a concern. It would be quite the problem. Kind of one of the best examples too are these bottom two examples here. So in the middle one, it actually has a button where if you click the button, it doesn't let you know anything happened. And obviously in the good example, it shows, a completion screen, and even tiny things like that will make the difference in users' minds of how aggravating an experience actually is to undergo. And that last one, we've all been there before, man. If you have a list, I have my thumbnails on my computer permanently set to at least medium. Oh my gosh, trying to find files, image files just by name is the most painful experience. Especially if you have a lot of them. It's just DSC 999. It's big sad. But here we go. And this is just wanted to hop in with a good example of that. Yeah, I just wanted to say I will be kind of vaguely looking at the chat, but I guess yes, I'll be looking at the chat. So feel free to type any questions. But I'll also kind of pause every once in a while if you have any questions about stuff.
I can always just look at the chat, and if there's something particularly interesting, I can just let you know.
Oh my gosh, she's so lovely. Thank
Oh,
you.
of course. All right.
Yeah, so let's hop into kind of what makes a design good. Design is complicated. I'm just going to start off with that. It's really subjective to context and extremely subjective to user needs specifically. So it's extremely hard to kind of say what is good or bad in any kind of objective sense. But despite that, we obviously need baselines. There are rules of thumb. There are things that we can generalize that need to be followed. And that's what we do. Researchers have been going hard at this, trying to come up with rules and strategies that we can apply in a more general context. So the definition we came up with is kind of very broadly, it's to create a functional product that meets the user need, right? So, obviously the first step of that is understanding the user need. And there is a whole process to UX, there's a whole process to research, getting user feedback, prototyping, understanding what it is they actually are trying to accomplish, and making sure that your product is accomplishing that goal or helping them accomplish that goal in the most streamlined way you can. We're gonna kind of go over that. We'll touch on that a little bit, but we're gonna focus more on the visual side as well as the usability side of our workshop today. But I just wanted to make sure that that is in the air, that there is really a whole research process to this. If you're taking Computer Science 341 or planning to, that's kind of what that class is about. So we'll kind of touch on that vaguely, but there is a process there. So we're going to hop into a few of the sets of rules. If you're in 341, this is going to look extremely familiar to you. But this is just sets of rules that go through the sets of rules that you can apply to UI, specifically web design and specifically interface design. And you can kind of use these rules to guide your decisions and the choices that you're making. We won't go through each one in crazy depth, but we will provide these slides after the workshop. So feel free, this will be a resource for you. And we also have the full posters in the doc as well. So you'll be able to look at them better, because yeah, we're designing for you guys, we're applying our own rules. But yeah, this is Schneiderman. I always forget if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but cool dude, made some rules. He has a lot of rules. I'll generalize them at the end, but just to go through them, there's striving for consistency, which talks about, making sure the elements within your app are consistent and making sure that you're being consistent with things outside of your app. So for example, red generally means stop. Don't play games with that inside of your app. Like if you make things that are supposed to go and are red, what are you doing? Things like allowing for shortcuts, you want to make sure that proficient users are able to do things quickly because they don't want to have to go through the nested list of menus to do each individual task they're trying to achieve if they've been using your app for a year. Informative feedback, dialogue for closure is something that is super important that I used to forget all the time. Making sure that you give users the sense of completion, like when they're going through a process, let them know when things have been finished, let them know where they're at, how much stuff is left to do. There is that kind of angst of like, imagine if you were watching a lecture video and it never showed you how much time is left in the lecture video. You know what I mean? The pain is there, right? You don't really know where you're at. Having that feeling is important. Preventing and handling errors just seems standard. I'm sure comp sci people are just hitting this hard. Making undoing easy. People make mistakes, don't punish them for that. Leave them in control, I think, is something we forget too as computer scientists, and even with the advent of AI. It's really easy to forget that people generally do like to do things. They like to know what's going on in the software, know what's happening from time to time. And sometimes there is that push to kind of like do a bunch of stuff, but you got to make sure you're at least letting them know what's happening and guiding them through it, giving them the options to choose different procedures as they see fit. And reducing the user's memory load, which goes back to that kind of thumbnail thing. You want to give them a preview. You don't want to make them have to actively remember a bunch of information when you can just show them right there, right? Like it's just easier, it's just harder. Like imagine if at your Amazon checkout screen, they just said, oh, are you ready to buy? And they didn't tell you how much it was going to cost again. You know what I mean? Like, even though in theory you could have remembered that from the previous screen, it's actually just better to show them again, give them that kind of remembrance, chug their memory just so that they're able to get back into it a little smoother. Nielsen's 10 design heuristics, a lot of these match really concisely, or I don't know the word as I'm looking for here. A lot of these align really well with Schneiderman's 8 golden rules. So I won't go over these in too much detail, but I will go over the new ones. The kind of newer ones are match system with reality, which is just kind of a more specific example of blending the real world, right? Like there are words that we use in development, and then there are real things that people discuss, and there are concepts that people use in real life that don't exist in development. And I think just bridging that gap is something that's super important. So making sure that our interfaces are doing things that allow people to understand things better. It's kind of hard to see this without examples, but there is an example here, which is, the word register, which is something we use in real life, but it's kind of different, right? Like we understand registration as being, registration is in a comp sci context is, making an account in a website, right? But let's say you're trying to join a service, the word you'd use in real life is you just say like, hey, I want to join, right? So perhaps if you make a button that says join in, it will be a little easier to understand the meaning from that just from by the label, right? Things like that, things that we have to start thinking about when we design for users. The only thing here that's different is documentation. This is a hackathon, so go hard, guys. But when you're building your projects, you want to make sure that when people get confused, there exists documentation they can consult to understand how best to use your product, and that they can go at it more efficiently. So make it searchable, make it easy, make it broken down so that they can understand how best to find the information they're looking for. Then there are the usability principles, which honestly, I'm not going to lie, whoever designs the usability principles, they're wonderful, but the words they used, oh my gosh, just yikes. Here we go, though. I'm just going to leave these up because these very generally, they easily generalize to a lot of other things, but the broad ones are learnability. So making sure that it's easy to learn how to use your app and then continue using it and understand easily what's going on to make those connections in your brain that like, oh, when I do this, it goes to that. When I do that, it goes to this. Breaking that down simpler. There's flexibility, which is things like multitasking, making sure there's different ways to achieve a single goal, making sure that there's a clean handoff between the work done by the user and the work done by the system, and understanding where those breaks are. Then there's robustness, which are things like, your app doesn't break. When it does break, you can fix it. It goes fast. It does the things they're trying to get it to do. You're telling them when things are happening. You're being communicative through the UI. And yeah, that's just what robustness covers. Sorry, I blitzed through that really fast. Again, you can find this in the slides. This is what I wanted to get to. So we actually can generalize these. Over the summer, I did this for a project. We were generalizing these into 4 major rules for UI, UX, interface design, and things like that. And you really just want to focus on these things every time you make a design and just run through them and make sure that they're still being followed in your mock-up, in your actual products, I guess, you'll be building. So flexible freedom and control, making sure the user is able to have that kind of flexibility, that freedom, that they know what's going on. They're really being hands-on. It's not just a bunch of stuff happening outside of their control, but make it flexible, like they should have the ability to say, I'm okay with this being done by the computer or this being done by me, and give them that flexibility of shortcuts versus menu items, or clicking the button versus using tabs and hitting the button with enter. Just kind of giving them those different options, I think, is something that we forget a lot, but is really important to good software. Communication and cooperation is something that, again, easy to forget, but super important. Be communicative, have your dialogues pop up, type them out nicely. Don't use a bunch of complex language that the user will obviously not know. Say things in easy words, give error warnings, things like that. Error prevention and handling. The general rule should be, if you can make it impossible to make an error, do it. If you can't, handle it. So if it's not to the best of your power, if there's ever a way to just avoid an error from being possible, do that. Make it impossible, because it's so much harder to handle them. But if you do have to handle them, do it properly. Let undo be a thing. Handle that in a way that makes sense for the people using it too. Simplicity and minimalism is a kind of joint UX and UI thing. Just as people, when things get overwhelming, when there's too much on the screen, when there's too much going on, it is a little harder to actually use the program. So being able to make things more simplistic, minimalizing, is that a word? I hope it is. Minimalizing the things that are going on will allow people to be able to digest the content a little better, understand your UI a little easier, and then be able to use your service and use your product, which is obviously what we are trying to achieve. Yeah, so that's what the generalized forms are. Hopefully this can be something to refer to and build your app around. So we wanted to move into kind of the dichotomy between UI and UX. When we were designing this, we actually wanted to type in definitions here, but the definitions are so complicatedly, like they're interacting and they're also not at the same time. Very generally though, UI is like the visual side of it. It's more of the visual, but also you're still applying those design principles, but it's more of the kind of like the hands-on part of it, right? It's the part that you're actually interacting with. That's the UI. The UX is more of kind of the abstract thought behind that. So the flow, like how are you going from screen to screen? Which screen comes next? What can you do on that screen? Does it make sense for you to be able to do that there? Should you have done that before? Things like that. Like UX is kind of considering again, it stands for user experience. So it considers the entire experience of using your product. So UX can be applied to anything. There are UX studies on doors, if you've ever heard of the Norman door thing. So there's UX experiences with UX in everything. You can apply it to a lot of things, but UI is very typically associated with digital products, so apps and websites. But yeah, both of them interact a lot. Having one without the other is extremely complicated. So you definitely do need to be thinking about both of them. There is the visual aspect, because as much as we want to apply UX, if things don't have good UI, it's just bad in general, no matter how much UX thought you put into it. And if you don't put any UX thought into it, you come up with extremely beautiful designs that don't make any sense. I'm talking about Dribble. I'm sorry, this is just an inside joke. But yeah, I just want to make sure that this is kind of the explicit, that this is a dichotomy, but it's something that we need to consider both sides of. Okay, so here's the source. We're getting into some UI design tricks, visual design tricks that we just thought would be really good, like really fast. If you have no idea what you're doing with design, you think you're bad at design, you're not, I promise you. These are just a handful of tricks that you can apply super easily to your web designs or app mockups to make them, I promise you, they'll just look better. I'll go on record for that, man. Like you can text me after the hackathon and be like, Opie, you're totally right. And then when you sell your product to Google for $10 million, I will happily take 5%. Don't worry. Okay, so here we go. Here's the 3-2-1 rule. People from Design Club might know this because I mentioned it in an earlier meeting. However, the 3-2-1 rule, I just made up that name. Don't try and Google that. There is a video on it. I'll try to link it in the doc before we send it. 3-2-1 rule, it is explained here, but I'll just kind of elaborate on this. It's a layout rule, right? So it's a way to make engaging layouts. What it stems from is psychological understanding of how people approach information, right? So we are very visual, obviously, like when we look at things. So we look at things in terms of shapes, and layouts feel more engaging when your eyes are being guided around the shape. We call this hierarchy in design, but just for this, you have to understand that when you look at something, you can typically tell where you're supposed to be looking. We tried to design this presentation like that. So if you notice it, we're killing it. But yeah, you have to make sure that there is a hierarchy there, because hierarchical structures are easier to digest as information just in general. We'll get into this more in the second rule because they interact. But just for now, if you look at this poster, we have that kind of large element that is like a really intriguing kind of draw in. Then you move down into the medium element and you move down into the small element, right? Just to overline the rule, just so I can say it for the recording reasons, I guess. When you are designing engaging layouts, you want to make sure that there is that, just very basically, again, this is a rule that you can break depending on situation, but you want to make sure there is a large element, a medium element, and a small element. And you can have multiple of each, but having that kind of really firm breakdown between the sizes gives this dynamism that I can't explain any better than it's just like, mwah, like it's just good. It's just good, I promise you. So this is a good example, I guess. They can be placed in different places. I don't want to make it seem like you have to put them in this order. It has to go big, medium, small. It can be like big, small, medium. There's actually some examples of that in the next slides we have. And you can definitely play with it, but I just think that when you apply this rule, you'll find that in interface design, it pops off. So even just now, if you think about this, we'll get into more examples hopefully later. But even if you're just thinking about it, websites like Apple, portfolio websites, things like that, they typically have one super huge image. They have one main kind of title. It's called a hero. It's called the hero text, but some kind of title text thing in the middle. Then they'll have smaller text or a CTA, right? And the reason that's so engaging is because the big thing draws you in. You immediately move to the medium thing because the big thing has no text in it. So you move into the medium thing immediately, and then you drop down into the small thing because it seems like the next visual thing to go to, right? There's kind of just a reason our brains follow that order. And this is well studied, which is why we apply it as a rule. So yeah, this is a good rule. Helped me a bunch. Your layouts will look way better if you apply this, I promise. This is kind of a rule that builds on that rule, but it moves more into the typography landscape. Obviously, as you're building websites, as you're building apps, you're going to need a lot of text. Well, not a lot, but there'll be text in your thing, most likely. So this kind of the constant debate, how do you make bodies of text readable? Like, I don't want to read it. No one really wants to read it. How do I make it so that people will actually read it? And this is how. This is just one of the techniques people use for this. There are a bunch of typography rules. If you want to nerd out about typography, join Design Club, I guess. I don't know. But for this rule, it's kind of it's an easy way to distinguish sections of text. And by sections, I mean title to subtitle, subtitle to body text to small text, captions, things like that. The way you want to differentiate that is the general rule that I learned. I forgot even who taught me this, but the general rule is that you halve the font size and then you take 2 font weights down. Just to be fully inclusive, a font weight is just, it's just bold, semi-bold, things like that. So normally there's usually only like normal and bold. And if you're not into design at all, those are the only 2 you've ever heard of. But yeah, designer fonts pop off. So there'll be like 7 font weights. Usually they start with thin. There's usually like ultra thin, light, or like ultra thin, ultra light, or like ultra thin, extra light, sorry, light, regular, medium, semi-bold, bold, extra bold, and black. Those are the like set usually you get. But those are like, kind of the extensive set. Generally, fonts will have at least 5. So you kind of want to play with that. And if you look at this poster we kind of quickly designed here, you can see how, not to pat ourselves on the back too much, but it kind of looks banger. But you can tell that kind of as you look at this, there is a kind of inclination to read it in the order that we decided it should be read in. You go to the title, then you move to the subtitle, then you move to the body. And at no point does it ever feel like anything could be anything else. The subtitle is definitely a subtitle. It doesn't feel like it's just part of the title that's weirdly there. And, this is something that you know, I can pull up bad examples of this, and if we get time at the end, I'll try and pull up some bad examples of this. But yeah, when you make things that are supposed to be different look too similar, it bothers people because we naturally want to scan information for contrast, and that's how we easily break down information. So once you start messing with that, people start kind of not understanding what's happening. And also, just as a callback, a good example of this is also a good example of the 3-2-1 rule. So you see that big circle kind of functions as the large element that adds kind of that character to the design. Then you have the title and kind of the subtitle as well become this medium size element. And then the body text is this kind of smaller element that you ignore until you've kind of traversed the big element, the medium element, then you get back down to the small one, right? See how that kind of like cyclical flow? So as a designer, you can actually kind of control where they look and when, and that's something you should pay attention to as you're making your designs. Okay, this is another rule. Just wanted to put this in there, white space. One of the things I see a lot, and including me, like when I've made designs or I see other people's designs and I'm critiquing them, don't be afraid of white space. Honestly, like, you know, I think it's something that I'm going to talk about a lot, where the better you get at design, the kind of more comfortable you are with breaking these kind of mental rules. And I think there's a temptation there where there's space, I have to fill it, I have to put stuff in there. But honestly, the best designs have so much white space. And white space doesn't have to be white, obviously, it just has to be empty space in the design. So this post is just a quick example we cooked up of that, right? You can just kind of go straight to the point, just put some elements in for style and just leave the empty space. It's just nice. Everyone can just ambiently enjoy it. So yeah, definitely don't be afraid of that. Add some space. It gives it a lot more visual personality. It makes people focus on the things you want them to focus on more. And it just looks prettier, let's be real. So yeah, keep that in mind as you're making your designs too. Okay, we wanted to throw this in. And this is something that we are gonna kind of tease really hard because we have a second Figma workshop at the end of the month where we'll have more time to kind of go into the hard nitty gritty of this. But for now, here's some web design tips. So yeah, we'll talk more about how to do this actually in Figma, like really making this. There is an option for it, so like, don't worry, it's not like super complicated, but making the grids is super chill, but using them properly in the way that complements what they were designed for is something that requires a little bit of practice. So we'll go over that more at the end of the month, but for now, here's kind of an overview of what they are and what they are for. So obviously there is that kind of difference between design and development. You know, you don't just want your designer going crazy, building all these crazy things on your designs, and the developers have no idea how to implement them. So grids are kind of one of the ways we reach that middle ground, right? So we designed a system, which we use as grids, that mimics CSS grids or flexboxes so that developers can more easily implement them. So that's just what that is. I think I have an example, but this is kind of the general rule. So this is what a typical 12-column grid looks like. Don't be confused. I know I said grid and these are just columns. I don't know why we named it this. People just call these things names and we'll just go along with it. We're just here for the ride. But yeah, this is called a 12-column grid. It's a very common grid layout. And simply described, it is literally 12 columns. You put 12 columns. These things all have technical names that, again, we'll go over in a different thing, but I'll zoom through them now. So there's the margin, which is how far it is in from both sides that fixes it. If you know Bootstrap, that's just the container div. So then the rules of grids are that everything kind of gets invisibly put inside these hypothetical boxes, which sounds kind of bizarre, but it makes sense, I promise. So you can kind of imagine everything needs to go, Matthew, so amazing. Yes, those links are legendary, I promise. They teach you so much. But yeah, you kind of put everything inside of these imaginary boxes. And in these boxes, they kind of define the space they're allowed to take up. So for example, this box that we have on the left here, it takes up 6 columns, right? It's a 6-column setup. Like we're using a 6-3-3 setup right here, I think. Yeah, a 6-3-3. So one thing is going to take up 6 columns, one thing's going to take up 3, and the other thing also takes up 3. Once you see this once, you'll start noticing it all over the place. So for example, Reddit. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Is that a question? Or am I good? Do feel free to just ask questions though. I know I'm kind of speaking fast. Okay, I'm just going to continue and hope that wasn't a burning question. Okay. Yeah. So Reddit, for example, uses a 8:4 grid, I believe. So there's the main content that kind of takes up this 8 space, and then there's kind of the card that sits on the right, I believe, which is the 4 grid. Twitter has a also uses a 2-column kind of layout. Like it uses this big thing that takes up, I think, 8. I think Twitter also uses 8. I'm not sure though. It's in this link. Anyway, I should probably stop trying to pull up examples from memory. I'll just go to them later. But you'll start seeing it all over the place. There is an ease to that. If you're wondering why we do this and kind of what the point of any of this is, the reason is because responsive layouts, and that's why we need it. So for example, if I define everything on this 12-column grid, it means I can actually write directly into my CSS that each of these boxes is going to rearrange in a highly specific way once the screen size decreases in a highly specific way. So for example, in this, I might have it so that both of these smaller blocks go under the big block when the screen gets squeezed to that size. And it's just easier to make this handoff to developers. If you use grids while you design, it'll make a lot more sense when you're implementing it, because it'll be extremely obvious what the proportions of each thing are. You're not just kind of guessing and gambling when you're making it. It'll be very specific, like this is double the width of this, and this thing needs to be here, but when I squeeze it and there's only 4 columns, then obviously it goes under, right? So just to wrap that kind of bit up, typically what people use is they use a 12-column grid for websites, a 6-column grid, I believe. So it's 12-column grid for websites. Oh, it's 12-column for websites, 8-column for tablets, and 4 columns for phones and apps. So why that matters and what the whole point of this is that, so for example, I made this design and I can just say to my developer, there's 12 columns here. So when you're designing this for the website to be displayed on a desktop, all 12 columns are available. I want them lined out like this. When we move to a tablet per se, and there's only 8 columns available, you already know intuitively that obviously the 2 boxes on the right won't be able to fit. So they have to go on the next line so that I can fit the design within 8 columns. And then when I move to a phone where it only has 4 columns, I know that I'm going to have to squeeze the 6-column box into 4 columns, take the 2 boxes, put them underneath one after another so that they'll fit in this 4-column layout, right? So it's just this kind of hypothetical thing that we use, and it's extremely good. It's used all over the industry. If you get into UI design, it's all over the place. So getting good at grids is a very valuable skill, but it will help you a lot as you're just rapidly making these designs to be implemented in your hackathon projects too. Okay, I'll move on. I spent too much time on that. Here's an example of using grids. This card thing I was saying, this is an example we cooked up for one of our design challenges actually. So you see how kind of like each of these cards, I know this seems a little confusing. I said everything has to be within these grids, but there are so many rules. Again, we'll go over this later. It's more of like, for now, just think of the big picture. Each big block sits inside of a certain number of columns. So this kind of block on the left sits inside of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 columns. And then the block on the right sits inside of 4 columns. So I've kind of broken the screen in that way, and that's how that will work. So you can imagine you can just mentally imagine what's happening if I squeeze the screen. That bottom thing might go under, these things might start squeezing, right? It starts to make a little bit of sense there. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of how you'd use this 12-column grid layout. Okay, let's move on to some usability stuff. What you all came for, I hope. So usability is obviously a huge field of design, making sure that our products are usable, people can use them, and that they account for different kinds of people, I think is the real important part. WCAG, I cannot for the life of me come up with a cool way of saying that quickly. WCAG, I don't know. WCAG is an organization that, it's an organization that makes rules for this kind of stuff. It's dope. They make a lot of rules. There's a lot of specifications. They give grades to websites and things like that. It's kind of it's a read. It's a fun read, but it's a read. So take a look if you want to. There are a lot of rules. So I guess like keep those in mind when you're designing, like not everyone is like you. Everyone has different needs. There are different things that need to be accounted for. Even things as obvious as screen readers, right? Like we don't often think about that as designers sometimes, but it's important to make sure that you remember that, there are screen readers. Like blind people might want to use your product. And if they want to use your product, they're going to have to rely on these screen reading technologies to read out the content to them. And if your website isn't optimized for that, then you're just creating a terrible experience for this demographic of people, kind of just for no reason, right? So it's cool to keep these things in mind and make sure that we're designing for as many people as we can. So yeah, we just wanted to tease that and say, like, please do go through that in your free time. But we'll go over some of kind of the two, I think, or maybe three of the biggest ones that we see kind of overlooked that very quickly you can apply and start thinking about. First one, contrast. Contrast matters so much. Specifically here, we're talking about color contrast and things like that. The thing to remember is that a lot of people actually suffer from color blindness in some form, or color dysfunctions and things like that. And it's far more common of a problem than a lot of people think it is. And I think it's the kind of thing that, again, is super easy to overlook if you don't have color blindness. But it does matter. So for example, noticing that pretty things that have very low color contrast sometimes look really pretty, right? Like having that kind of soft color on the soft color, like it creates a vibe that is kind of dope and it looks kind of cool. But people with any kind of color blindness just won't be able to see it. Like it just looks like a blank page to them. And I think sometimes keeping that in mind is important. So we actually linked some tools that help you use that. I'll probably hop into those tools in a second here. I'll just finish up the slideshow part. So Who Can Use is a tool that compares two colors. And just going back to the WCAG, they actually have a formula. There's a real formula that actually compares two colors, and it can tell you the contrast ratio. And there are thresholds to meet for contrast ratios to get certain grades in WCAG. Anyway, if that sounded kind of confusing, don't worry about it. The website will just give you like a big green button or a big red button as to whether or not you passed or failed. So don't worry. But yeah, Who Can Use is a good website. It shows you the difference between your two colors and the contrast ratio. And it also shows you what that will look like, what that contrast will look like with different kinds of visual impairments and things like that. So it's a good way to just kind of look at your interface and be like, yikes, is this going to work or not? One thing we found while we were kind of working on this is this website Get Stuck. And what they do is it's actually a plugin in Figma. And what it does is it, instead of just comparing two colors, you can actually change the mode in your Figma, and it will redisplay your whole design based on which visual impairment you've selected. So if you've selected color, like, I forgot what it's called, dyschromia, like there's trichromia and then there's duchromia. Anyway, if you select duchromia, which is when you're missing one of the color cones in your eyes, it'll just redisplay your whole design as if that was as if that was you, and it will just kind of let you see what your design looks like. I think that might be it, protanopia. Anyway, I just see OP. No, I'm playing, but yeah, it lets you kind of see what your design will look like to other people with different kinds of color blindness, and it's super useful. One, just for usability, but also just for like design and prettiness, you know, like if I'm using this cool design and I think it's dope, but it just looks abysmal to anyone without perfect vision, it's like, I kind of want it to look dope with everyone. So then there's kind of goals like that and things that we focus on regarding that. Typography. Oh my gosh. So typography is like a close to my heart. I love text, love typography. It's great. People like scanning. We scan things a lot. All we do is scan as people. And it's just fastest to scan, right? So, you know, I put that example there of like, wonder how you can read this. And, you know, you've probably seen these on social media and all that. You know, the whole rule where if you keep the first and last letter of an English word the same, and you just change the middle ones randomly, most people can just read it completely fine as if there was no problem. And that's because your mind actually is you save words as if they're images. I could talk about this all day, but it's the whole concept of how you don't actually have to read a word to read the word. For the most part, you're just scanning. And the reason this all is important is because people are kind of downloading shapes from your text. They're not actually reading it in the same way you think they are. So it's actually way better, drastically so, to put text in sentence case. So as in the capital letter only exists at the beginning of the sentence and everything else is lowercase. Way easier to read that than text in capitals, because when you put text in capitals, the shape is just a box. Like every word has the same shape now. So your mind kind of has to like go in and actually read the text. I put this example here. Hopefully you're kind of noticing it. You know, it's something that we typically don't notice, but if you look at it, it's just faster to read the first half of that sentence than it is to read the last half, because you actually have to read it to understand what the words are saying. But anyway, maybe I'm just getting a little ahead of myself. But yeah, capital letters typically ruin the kind of shapes people are scanning for. So it's important to make sure that you're accounting for that. Another thing that I actually didn't put in the slide is alignment matters a lot. So again, I don't want to go too hard into the design theory for this, but when you make a paragraph, so this is left aligned text, right? Everything is aligned to the left, and then there's the bumpy sides on the right. We call those rags, the bumpy sides of a paragraph. This is why you should avoid center aligning text in general. You can center align titles because it's only one line. You can center align short, extremely short sentences because they're like 1 or 2 lines tops. But if there's ever a body of text that is more than 2 lines, it's almost never optimal to center align it. The problem with center aligning is because you put the rags, the bumpy sides, on both sides. Both sides are bumpy now. So there's no, again, this is kind of like a lot of, it's going to get kind of psychological, but there's no anchor. Like we use, when we scan things, we scan extremely quickly, and we use an anchor to bring our eyes back so we can scan quicker. Maybe I'll pull this up again. We might actually have time for me to go hard on this, but I'll pull this up. People have done studies where they show people bodies of text and they use eye tracking to visualize the heat map of like where people are looking at most often. And this is just a well understood rule in design where people scan things in an F shape. So you mostly will read the line on the left where the text is aligned to, you'll read that line, and then you'll read like little bursts out of that line as you scan. That's how people scan fast, right? So if you center align text, you actually ruin that, because then there's nothing for me to go back to. I have to keep changing the position I'm going back to for each side of the paragraph, and it's harder to read that way. But for English text, well, I mean, for any text actually, no matter which direction people read in, so obviously for languages like languages that are read in the opposite direction, you'd align it to the right. But for English, it's read from left to right. So you want to align it to the left so that I know where the beginning of the next thing is. Like I always know it'll be on that side in the same place, so I can just bounce back and forth between it to scan faster. So anyway, that was a whole little scourge. I hope that was interesting. I kind of went off there. But yeah, another thing to make sure is, yeah, making sure scanning is easy. So as well as applying the left align rule, basically as a rule of thumb, you almost have no reason to ever not left align something. Generally just left align whenever you can, because it'll make it easier for people to read. If you apply the left aligning, you apply the 3-2-1 rule, and you apply the half and half rule, you'll have pretty readable text pretty quickly. But on top of that, you have to make sure that we actually tried to design the slideshow like this. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but we wanted to make it easily scannable. So we kept the paragraph lengths very short. That's also something you want to keep an eye out for. I don't know about you. You can just put in the chat if you agree. I'm just going to say this. When you see a bunch of text, like if I open a website and it's just pure HTML and the text goes from like side to side, bro, literally missed me with that. Like, it's so not fun. Can I get some homies in the chat? Like, it's not a good idea. If the paragraph width, like if it's just long, it just feels like pain to read. And there's actually a reason for that. Again, this is a well-studied thing where people are more likely to actually read text if you keep the character length between 50 and 65. Again, this is a very loose rule, but come on, Linus Mason. Yeah, this is a very loose rule, but you want to make sure you're keeping track of it, right? Like you want to make sure that you don't have too many characters on an individual line of a paragraph. Am I back? Okay, yes. Yeah, so you want to make sure that you want to keep a certain number of characters per line, just so that it's easier to read, like you actually want to read it. And this also has things to do with font size, making sure that you're not making the text too small, that it's a strain to read it. But generally, yeah, you want to make sure that's there. There was actually a question. Yeah, Matt just answered that. But yeah, literally exactly what Matt said is the reason. So the question was, is justified text better? So that's what people said. Justified is where the text is exactly pinned to both sides. It's one of the options in Word and Google Docs if you've ever seen it. So it actually just makes it so that both sides are lined up, and then it just puts extra spacing between the words to make sure it's lined up perfectly. Yeah, so Matt said it, like the reason it's kind of bad is because the irregular spacing screws with reading the same way that the irregular rag screws reading. So you can use justified tags, but only when there's enough text in your paragraph that the irregular spacing is unnoticeable. So only if it's like you have a paragraph that's left aligned and it's just barely not a perfect rectangle and you want to make it a perfect rectangle, that is the excusable use for justified text. Like you can do whatever you want then. But otherwise, miss me with that. Like don't play that game. It kind of messes with people's reading because the spacing gets weird. But yes, thanks, Matt, and thanks for the question, Ebony. Okay, so that was the end of the stuff we wanted to cover. That's the content. We got you with the source. The stuff we wanted to cover. We have more time than I thought we were gonna have, so I could actually go back and give some of the explanations and the examples of some of the things we mentioned. But if you have any questions, I'll pause for now, and feel free to unmute and ask me questions, or ask questions to the abyss in general. Thanks, Matt. That's the link to our Figma doc, our legendary Figma doc.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, first off, thank you for the talk. I really appreciated it. I was like always into programming, so I never really like fully appreciated like design or gotten more into it recently.
Oh,
But also, I was just wondering about the grids. Like you
right.
have 12 grids. Would this be different for different platforms? Like, would it be different for like websites on, if you were viewing the websites on, say, like a phone, or would it be different for apps?
Oh, right. I see what you're asking. Yeah. So actually, that's kind of it's the best part of grids. So what we use them for is, I don't know. I kind of said this a little fast, so I'll kind of go into more in detail here. So it's called the 12 grids, 12 column grid is because we set it up like it's 12 columns, right? You have to kind of imagine. So imagine that a screen on a desktop is 12 columns, but kind of imagine that on a tablet you only have space for 8 of those columns, and then on a phone you only have space for 4 of those columns, right?
Mm,
So for example, in this kind of layout we kind of made randomly, sorry, you want to make, so if I moved to a tablet, see how the first block takes up 6 columns, but the second one takes up 3. So if I only had 8 columns available, the second block wouldn't be able to fit on the same line, right?
yeah.
So I would have to move those 2 second blocks to the next line on a tablet, right?
Mm,
And then when I move to a phone, I only have 4 blocks available. So the 6 block one has to get squeezed into 4 blocks. Like I'd have to squeeze that into 4 blocks. And then the 2 3 block ones will just go underneath one after another.
right.
You see what I'm saying? Like this is why we use
Yeah.
it. It's an easy way to communicate to your developers where the breakpoints are. So this is a CSS concept, but breakpoints are kind of like when you're squeezing a website and then it randomly kind of reorganizes the content. Those are breakpoints. So they'll change the organization of the data based on how small you're trying to view it on. And that's why websites don't just infinitely shrink and it's just tiny.
Mm,
Like, yeah, they actually kind of reorganize the content. So a kind of big thing in design is responsive design, making sure that your design is able to function, like you said, on phones, in an app, in tablets, things like that. Even with the advent of things like React Native, which let you design apps using HTML and things like that.
mm,
So what that enables you to do with this design process is design for all of those kinds of devices all at the same time, because mentally you know that every time I put something in this grid, depending on how much space it takes, will decide where it gets placed in different screen sizes.
got it. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Have any tips, guides, or websites for choosing color palettes? Yes, I do. I'm sure Matt is just blazing his keyboard right now too. But one good example is Coolers. Actually, yeah, maybe I can. Can you guys still see my screen? Hoping that's good. Okay, cool. Coolers is a great example. Coolers is yeah, it's just dope. Yeah, I knew it, Matt. But yeah, Coolers is this website, super great, made by this legend right here. If I can ever click this down. Yeah, so it just lets you generate color palettes. It's super useful, super diverse. And also it actually lets you do the thing I was mentioning earlier. So you can actually look, where is it? Right here. You can select different kinds of color blindness and it will show you what the palette looks like with each of those different kinds of color blindness. So super useful for accessibility reasons. And we can also look at things like you can adjust it for brightness and things like that. Coolers is a great website. Yeah. It also lets you explore other people's palettes so that you don't have to start from scratch every time. Um, yeah. Yeah. So this is the banger place, I promise. But, you know, in terms of bigger brain advice with palettes, a kind of thing I've learned is don't get too carried away. Like, I'm sure a lot of this crowd is probably more computer science heavy, which honestly is a strength, because sometimes designers get a little carried away with our pretty colors. Like, the colors are so pretty to us, we love them, right? So we get a little carried away and we make designs that don't really work like functionally. So you want to make sure that before you start, yeah, you want to make sure you kind of limit the colors you're using. What I tend to do is take Bootstrap. I'll just go to Bootstrap. So if you don't know what Bootstrap is, let me just enlighten you right now. Bootstrap is like banger. If you're trying to cook up a project for web super fast and you're not super good at CSS, don't even worry. Just use Bootstrap, man. I promise you. So Bootstrap, what it is it's just literally like, so CSS is like how you define the styles in your websites, right? Bootstrap, imagine someone just gave you like a huge CSS document already. It's already made for you. That's what Bootstrap is. So all you got to do is add classes to your HTML elements, and Bootstrap does the rest for you. It's brilliant. And their documentation, mwah, mwah. It gives you like examples of everything. This is an example of like containers. Oh wait, let me grab an actual good example.
Yeah, I just want to swing in and say Bootstrap is incredible. I use it on practically every single web-related project I use, and it's phenomenal. So I highly recommend it.
Docs are wonderful. They show you basically every example of literally everything with the codes. You can just, it's so good. It's so good. But yeah, Bootstrap actually has this cool color system. Let me just find it. So this is what I do when I'm actually designing, like when I'm actually trying to design a layout. So I start with Bootstrap's colors. If I can, I don't know why I can't find them today. I think they're here. Theme colors, I think. Yeah, there we go. So basically what Bootstrap does is they break it down into, oh, right, yeah. They actually break the colors down into different use cases. There's things like success buttons, info, warnings, dangers, and things like that. I think what you want to do is you want to choose colors that achieve all of these goals, right? That's what you want to make sure that you're doing with your color palettes. So before you choose a palette, I think it's important to make sure you choose the use cases for them. So what is the primary color of your website? You know, what color do you want to use to indicate danger or like, you know, something's wrong, or what color do you want to use to indicate a warning or success or just information, right? And then you kind of go at it from that direction and build a palette in that way. And it usually works out better. It's easier to use. It saves you the hassle of going through just randomly choosing colors. Yeah. And we use Bootstrap just because writing CSS is kind of finicky. So just for example, Bootstrap CSS file is like 5,000 lines long if you format it. So would you want to write 5,000 lines of CSS like right off the bat? I don't want to. So yeah, it's just a good baseline. It lets you do a bunch of things without having to code the CSS, which can slow you down in a project. So yeah, that's why we use it. And yeah, just to be conscious of time, I don't want to take time out of the other workshops and such. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Let me know if you have any questions. UD is available, so feel free to drop questions in our server. And yeah, even during the hackathon, we'll be willing to review designs and things like that if you want feedback.
Cool. I think I'm going to stop the recording now.